Mind is an organic whole made up of cooperating individualities, in somewhat the same way that the music of an orchestra is made up of divergent but related sounds. No one would think it necessary or reasonable to divide the music into two kinds, that made by the whole and that of particular instruments, and no more are there two kinds of mind, the social mind and the individual mind. When we study the social mind, we merely fix our attention on larger aspects and relations, rather than on the narrower ones of ordinary psychology. The view that all mind acts together in a vital whole from which the individual is never really separate flows naturally from our growing knowledge of heredity and suggestion, which makes it increasingly clear that every thought we have is linked with the thought of our ancestors and associates, and through them with that of society at large. It is also the only view consistent with the general standpoint of modern science, which admits nothing isolate in nature. The unity of the social mind consists not in agreement, but in organization, in the fact of reciprocal influence or causation among its parts, by virtue of which everything that takes place in it is connected with everything else, and so is an outcome of the whole. Whether, like the orchestra, it gives forth harmony may be a matter of dispute, but that its sound, pleasing or otherwise, is the expression of a vital cooperation cannot well be denied. Certainly everything that I say or think is influenced by what others have said or thought, and in one way or another sends out an influence of its own in turn. This differentiated unity of mental or social life, present in the simplest intercourse but capable of infinite growth and adaptation, is what I mean in this work by social organization. It would be useless, I think, to attempt a more elaborate definition. We have only to open our eyes to see organization, and if we cannot do that, no definition will help us. In the social mind, we may distinguish, very roughly of course, conscious and unconscious relations. The unconscious being those of which we are not aware, which for some reason escape our notice. A great part of the influences at work upon us are of this character. Our language, our mechanical arts, our government and other institutions, we derive chiefly from people to whom we are but indirectly and unconsciously related. The larger movements of society, the progress and decadence of nations, institutions, and races, have seldom been a matter of consciousness until they were past. And although the growth of social consciousness is perhaps the greatest fact of history, it has still but a narrow and fallible grasp of human life. Social consciousness, or awareness of society, is inseparable from self-consciousness, because we can hardly think of ourselves excepting with reference to a social group of some sort, or of the group except with reference to ourselves. The two things go together, and what we are really aware of is a more or less complex personal or social whole, of which now the particular, now the general aspect is emphasized. In general, then, most of our reflective consciousness, of our wide-awake state of mind, is social consciousness, because a sense of our relation to other persons or of other persons to one another can hardly fail to be a part of it. Self and society are twin-born, we know one as immediately as we know the other, and the notion of a separate and independent ego is an illusion. This view, which seems to me quite simple and in accord with common sense, is not the one most commonly held, for psychologists and even sociologists are still much infected with the idea that self-consciousness is in some way primary and antecedent to social consciousness, which must be derived by some recondite process of combination or elimination. I venture, therefore, to give some further exposition of it, based in part on first-hand observation of the growth of social ideas in children. Descartes is, I suppose, the best-known exponent of the traditional view regarding the primacy of self-consciousness. Seeking an unquestionable basis for philosophy, he thought that he found it in the proposition, "I think, therefore I am," cogito ergo sum. This seemed to him inevitable, though all else might be illusion. "I observed," he says, "that whilst I thus wished to think that all was false, it was absolutely necessary that I, who thus thought, should be somewhat. And as I observed that this truth I think, hence I am, was so certain and of such evidence that no ground of doubt, however extravagant, could be alleged by the skeptics capable of shaking it, I concluded that I might, without scruple, accept it as the first principle of the philosophy of which I was in search. From our point of view, this reasoning is unsatisfactory in two essential respects. In the first place, it seems to imply that I consciousness is a part of all consciousness, when, in fact, it belongs only to a rather advanced stage of development. In the second, it is one-sided or individualistic in asserting the personal or I aspect to the exclusion of the social or we aspect, which is equally original with it. Introspection is essential to psychological or social insight, but the introspection of Descartes was, in this instance, a limited, almost abnormal sort of introspection, that of a self-absorbed philosopher doing his best to isolate himself from other people and from all simple and natural conditions of life. The mind into which he looked was in a highly technical state, not likely to give him a just view of human consciousness in general. Introspection is of a larger sort in our day. There is a world of things in the mind worth looking at, and the modern psychologist, instead of fixing his attention wholly on an extreme form of speculative self-consciousness, puts his mind through an infinite variety of experiences, intellectual and emotional, simple and complex, normal and abnormal, sociable and private, recording in each case what he sees in it. He does this by subjecting it to suggestions or incitements of various kinds which awaken the activities he desires to study. In particular, he does it largely by what may be called sympathetic introspection, putting himself into intimate contact with various sorts of persons, and allowing them to awaken himself a life similar to their own, which he afterwards, to the best of his ability, recalls and describes. In this way, he is more or less able to understand, always by introspection, children, idiots, criminals, rich and poor, conservative and radical, any phase of human nature not wholly alien to his own. This I conceive to be the principal method of the social psychologist. One thing which this broader introspection reveals is that the I consciousness does not explicitly appear until the child is, say, about 2 years old, and that when it does appear, it comes in inseparable conjunction with the consciousness of other persons and of those relations which make up a social group. It is in fact simply one phase of a body of personal thought, which is self-consciousness in one aspect and social consciousness in another. The mental experience of a newborn child is probably a mere stream of impressions, which may be regarded as being individual, in being differentiated from any other stream, or as social, in being an undoubted product of inheritance and suggestion from human life at large, but is not aware either of itself or of society. Very soon, however, the mind begins to discriminate personal impressions, and to become both naively self-conscious and naively conscious of society. That is, the child is aware in an unreflective way of a group and of his own special relation to it. He does not say I, nor does he name his mother, his sister, or his nurse, but he has images and feelings out of which these ideas will grow. Later comes the more reflective consciousness which names both himself and other people, and brings a fuller perception of the relations which constitute the unity of this small world. And so on to the most elaborate phases of self-consciousness and social consciousness, to the metaphysician pondering the ego, or the sociologist meditating on the social organism. Self and society go together, as phases of a common whole. I am aware of the social groups in which I live as immediately and authentically as I am aware of myself. And Descartes might have said, we think, cogitamus, on as good grounds as he said cogito. But, it may be said, this very consciousness that you are considering is after all located in a particular person, and so are all similar consciousnesses, so that what we see if we take an objective view of the matter is merely an aggregate of individuals, however social those individuals may be. Common sense, most people think, assures us that the separate person is the primary fact of life. If so, is it not because common sense has been trained by custom to look at one aspect of things and not another? Common sense, moderately informed, assures us that the individual has his being only as part of a whole. What does not come by heredity comes by communication and intercourse, and the more closely we look, the more apparent it is that separateness is an illusion of the I and community, the inner truth. Social organism, using the term in no abstruse sense but merely to mean a vital unity in human life, is a fact as obvious to enlightened common sense as individuality. I do not question that the individual is a differentiated center of psychical life, having a world of his own into which no other individual can fully enter, living in a stream of thought in which there is nothing quite like that in any other stream, neither his I, nor his you, nor his we, nor even any material object, all probably as they exist for him, have something unique about them. But this uniqueness is no more apparent and verifiable than the fact, not at all inconsistent with it, that he is in the fullest sense member of a whole, appearing such not only to scientific observation, but also to his own untrained consciousness. There is then no mystery about social consciousness. The view that there is something recondite about it and that it must be dug for with metaphysics and drawn forth from the depths of speculation springs from a failure to grasp adequately the social nature of all higher consciousness. What we need in this connection is only a better seeing and understanding of rather ordinary and familiar facts. We may view social consciousness either in a particular mind or as a cooperative activity of many minds. The social ideas that I have are closely connected with those that other people have, and act and react upon them to form a whole. This gives us public consciousness, or to use a more familiar term, public opinion, in the broad sense of a group state of mind which is more or less distinctly aware of itself. By this last phrase, I mean such a mutual understanding of one another's points of view on the part of the individuals or groups concerned as naturally results from discussion. There are all degrees of this awareness in the various individuals. Generally speaking, it never embraces the whole in all its complexity, but almost always some of the relations that enter into the whole. The more intimate the communication of a group, the more complete, the more thoroughly knit together into a living whole is its public consciousness. In a congenial family life, for example, there may be a public consciousness which brings all the important thoughts and feelings of the members into such a living and cooperative whole. In the mind of each member also, this same thing exists as a social consciousness, embracing a vivid sense of the personal traits and modes of thought and feeling of the other members. And finally, quite inseparable from all this, is each one's consciousness of himself, which is largely a direct reflection of the ideas about himself he attributes to the others, and is directly or indirectly altogether a product of social life. Thus all consciousness hangs together, and the distinctions are chiefly based on point of view. The unity of public opinion, like all vital unity, is one not of agreement, but of organization, of interaction and mutual influence. It is true that a certain underlying likeness of nature is necessary in order that minds may influence one another, and so cooperate in forming a vital whole. But identity, even in the simplest process, is unnecessary and probably impossible. The consciousness of the American House of Representatives, for example, is by no means limited to the common views, if there are any, shared by its members, but embraces the whole consciousness of every member so far as this deals with the activity of the House. It would be a poor conception of the whole which left out the opposition, or even one dissentient individual. That all minds are different is a condition, not an obstacle, to the unity that consists in a differentiated and cooperative life. Here is another illustration of what is meant by individual and collective aspects of social consciousness. Some of us possess a good many books relating to social questions of the day. Each of these books, considered by itself, is the expression of a particular social consciousness. The author has cleared up his ideas as well as he can and printed them. But a library of such books expresses social consciousness in a larger sense. It speaks for the epoch. And certainly no one who reads the books will doubt that they form a whole, whatever their differences. The radical and the reactionist are clearly part of the same general situation. There are, then, at least three aspects of consciousness which we may usefully distinguish. Self-consciousness, or what I think of myself. Social consciousness, in its individual aspect, or what I think of other people. And public consciousness, or a collective view of the foregoing as organized in a communicating group. And all three are phases of a single whole. So far as the moral aspect is concerned, it should be the result of this organic view of mind to make the whole teaching and practice of righteousness more rational and effectual by bringing it closer to fact. A moral view which does not see the individual in living unity with social wholes is unreal and apt to lead to impractical results. Have not the moral philosophies of the past missed their mark, in great part, by setting before the individual absolute standards of behavior without affording him an explanation for his backwardness or a program for his gradual advance? And did not this spring from not discerning clearly that the moral life was a social organism, in which every individual or group of individuals had its own special possibilities and limitations? In general, such systems, pagan and Christian, have said, all of us ought to be so and so, but since very few of us are, this is evidently a bad world. And they have had no large, well organized, slow but sure plan for making it better. Impracticable standards have the same ill effect as unenforceable law. They accustom us to separate theory from practice and make a chasm between the individual and the moral ideal. The present way of thinking tends to close up this chasm and bring both persons and ideals into more intelligible relations to real life. The sins or virtues of the individual, it seems, are never fortuitous or disconnected. They have always a history and collateral support, and are in fact more or less pleasing phases of a struggling, aspiring whole. The ideals are also parts of the whole, states of being achieved momentarily by those in front and treasured for the animation and solace of all. And the method of righteousness is to understand as well as may be the working of this whole and of all its parts, and to form and pursue practicable ideals based on this understanding. It is always to be taken for granted that there is no real break with history and environment. Each individual may be required to put forth a steadfast endeavor to make himself and his surroundings better, but not to achieve a standard unconnected with his actual state. And the same principle applies to special groups of all sorts, including nations, races, and religions. Their progress must be along a natural line of improvement suggested by what they are. We are thus coming under the sway of that relative spirit, of which, says Walter Pater, the ethical result is a delicate and tender justice in the criticism of human life. According to this, real reform must be sympathetic. That is, it must begin, not with denunciation, though that may have its uses, but with an intimate appreciation of things as they are, and should proceed in a spirit opposite to that in which we have commonly attacked such questions as the suppression of intemperance and the conversion of the heathen. Human nature, it appears, is very much the same in those we reckon sinners, as in ourselves. Good and evil are always intimately bound up together. No sort of men are chiefly given over to conscious badness, and to abuse men or groups in the large is unjust and generally futile. As a rule, the practical method is to study closely and kindly the actual situation, with the people involved in it, then gradually and carefully to work out the evil from the mixture by substituting good for it. No matter how mean or hideous a man's life is, the first thing is to understand him, to make out just how it is that our common human nature has come to work out in this way. This method calls for patience, insight, firmness, and confidence in men, leaving little room for the denunciatory egotism of a certain kind of reformers. It is more and more coming to be used in dealing with intemperance, crime, greed, and in fact all those matters in which we try to make ourselves and our neighbors better. I notice that the most effectual leaders of philanthropy have almost ceased from denunciation. Tacitly assuming that there are excuses for everything, they shun the negative side and spend their energy in building up the affirmative. This sort of morality does not, however, dispense with praise and blame, which are based on the necessity of upholding higher ideals by example and discrediting lower ones. All such distinctions get their meaning from their relation to an upward-striving general life, wherein conspicuous men serve as symbols through which the higher structure may be either supported or undermined. We must have heroes, and perhaps villains, though it is better not to think much about the latter, even though their performances, when closely viewed, appear to be an equally natural product of history and environment. In short, it makes a difference whether we judge a man with reference to his special history and lights, or to the larger life of the world, and it is right to assign exemplary praise or blame on the latter ground which would be unwarranted on the former. There is certainly a special right for every man, but the right of most men is partial, important chiefly to themselves and their immediate sphere, while there are some whose right is representative like that of Jesus, fit to guide the moral thought of mankind, and we cherish and revere these latter because they corroborate the ideals we wish to hold before us. It matters little for these larger purposes whether the sins or virtues of conspicuous persons are conscious or not. Our concern is with what they stand for in the general mind. In fact, conscious wickedness is comparatively unimportant because it implies that the individual is divided in his own mind and therefore weak. The most effective ill-doers believe in themselves and have a quiet conscience. And in the same way, goodness is most effectual when it takes itself as a matter of course and feels no self-complacency. Blame and punishment, then, are essentially symbolic, their function being to define and enforce the public will, and in no way imply that the offenders are of a different nature from the rest of us. We feel it to be true that with a little different training and surroundings, we might have committed almost any crime for which men are sent to prison, and can readily understand that criminals should not commonly feel that they are worse than others. The same principle applies to those malefactors, more dangerous perhaps, who keep within the law, and yet are terribly punished from time to time by public opinion. Perhaps it would be well if both those who suffer punishment and those who inflict it were more distinctly aware of its symbolic character and function. The former might find their sense of justice appeased by perceiving that, though what they did was natural and perhaps not consciously wrong, it may still need to be discredited and atoned for. The culprit is not separated from society by his punishment, but restored to it. It is his way of service, and if he takes it in the right spirit, he is better off than those who do wrong but are not punished. The rest of us, on the other hand, might realize that those in the pillory are our representatives, who suffer in a real sense for us. This would disincline us to spend in a cheap abuse of conspicuous offenders that moral ardor whose proper function is the correction of our own life. The spectacle of punishment is not for us to gloat over, but to remind us of our sins, which, as springing from the same nature and society, are sure to be much the same as that of the one punished. It is precisely because he is like us that he is punished. If he were radically different, he would belong in an insane asylum, and punishment would be mere cruelty. Under the larger view of mind, responsibility is broadened, because we recognize a broader reach of causation, but by no means lost in an abstract society. It goes with power and increases rapidly in proportion as the evil comes nearer the sphere of the individual's voluntary action, so that each of us is peculiarly responsible for the moral state of his own trade, family, or social connection. Contrary to a prevalent impression, it is in these familiar relations that the individual is least of all justified in being no better than his environment. Every act of the will, especially where the will is most at home, should be affirmative and constructive. It being the function and meaning of individuality that each one should be, in the direction of his chief activities, something other and better than his surroundings. Once admit the plea, "I may do what other people do," and the basis of righteousness is gone. Perhaps there is no moral fallacy so widespread and so pernicious as this. It is these no worse than other people decisions that paralyze the moral life in the one and in the whole, involving a sort of moral panmixia, as the biologists say, which, lacking any progressive impulse, must result in deterioration. In the end, it will justify anything, since there are always bad examples to fall back upon. It is commonly futile, however, to require any sharp break with the past. We must be content with an upward endeavor and tendency. It is quite true that we are all involved in a net of questionable practices from which we can only escape a little at a time and in cooperation with our associates. It is an error to imagine that the doctrine of individual responsibility is always the expedient and edifying one in matters of conduct. There is a sort of people who grow indignant whenever general causes are insisted upon, apparently convinced that whether these are real or not, it is immoral to believe in them. But it is not invariably a good thing to urge the will, since this, if overstimulated, becomes fagged, stale, and discouraged. Often it is better that one should let himself go and trust himself to the involuntary forces, to the nature of things, to God. The nervous or strained person only harasses and weakens his will by fixing attention upon it. It will work more effectively if he looks away from it, calming himself by a view of the larger whole. And not without reason, Spinoza counts among the advantages of determinism the attainment of happiness by man through realizing his intimate union with the whole nature of things. The distinction between things in our power and things not in our power, the avoidance of all disturbing passions, and the performance of social duties from rational desire for the common good. An obvious moral defect of the unbalanced doctrine of responsibility is that it permits the successful to despise the unfortunate, in the belief that the latter have only themselves to blame, a belief not countenanced by the larger view of fact. We may pardon this doctrine when it makes one too hard on himself or on successful wrongdoers, but as a rod with which to beat those already down, it is despicable. The annals of religion show that the moral life has always these two aspects, the particular and the general, as in the doctrines of freedom and predestination, or in the wrestlings with sin followed by self-abandonment that we find in the literature of conversion. Perhaps we may say that the deterministic attitude is morally good in at least two classes of cases. First, for nervous, conscientious individuals like Spinoza, whose wills need rather calming than stimulating, and also for anyone who may be even temporarily in a state of mental strain. Second, in dealing on a large scale with social or moral questions, whose causes must be treated dispassionately and in a mass. These questions of free will versus law and the like are but little, if at all, questions of fact. When we get down to definite facts bearing upon the matter, we find little or no disagreement, but rather questions of point of view and emphasis. If you fix attention on the individual phase of things and see life as a theater of personal action, then the corresponding ideas of private will, responsibility, praise, and blame rise before you. If you regard its total aspect, you see tendency, evolution, law, and impersonal grandeur. Each of these is a half-truth needing to be completed by the other. The larger truth, including both, being that life is an organic whole, presenting itself with equal reality in individual and general aspects. Argument upon such questions is without limit, since there is really nothing at issue, and in that sense the problem of freedom versus law is insoluble. Above all, the organic view of mind calls for social knowledge as the basis of morality. We live in a system, and to achieve right ends or any rational ends whatever, we must learn to understand that system. The public mind must emerge somewhat from its subconscious condition and know and guide its own processes. Both consciously and unconsciously, the larger mind is continually building itself up into wholes. Fashions, traditions, institutions, tendencies, and the like, which spread and diversify like the branches of a tree, and so generate an ever higher and more various structure of differentiated thought and symbols. The immediate motor and guide of this growth is interest, and wherever that points, social structure comes into being, as a picture grows where the artist moves his pencil. Visible society is, indeed, literally a work of art, slow and mostly subconscious in its production, as great art often is, full of grotesque and wayward traits, but yet of inexhaustible beauty and fascination. It is this we find in the history of old civilizations, getting from it the completed work of the artist without that strain and confusion of production which defaces the present. We get it, especially not from the history of the theorist or the statistician, but from the actual naive human record to be found in memoirs, in popular literature, in architecture, painting, sculpture, and music, in the industrial arts, in every unforced product of the mind. Social organization is nothing less than this variegation of life, taken in the widest sense possible. It should not be conceived as the product merely of definite and utilitarian purpose, but as the total expression of conscious and subconscious tendency, the slow crystallization in many forms and colors of the life of the human spirit. Any fairly distinct and durable detail of this structure may be called a social type, this being a convenient term to use when we wish to break up the whole into parts for analysis or description. Thus, there are types of personality, of political structure, of religion, of classes, of the family, of art, of language, also of processes like communication, cooperation, and competition, and so on. The whole is so various that from every new point of view, new forms are revealed. Social types are analogous to the genera, species, and varieties of the animal world, in being parts of one living whole and yet having a relative continuity and distinctness, which is susceptible of detailed study. Like biological types, also they exist in related systems and orders, are subject to variation, compete with one another, flourish and decay, may be flexible or rigid, and may or may not form prolific crosses with one another. Without forgetting to see life as individuals, we must learn to see it also as types, processes, and organization, the latter being just as real as the former. And especially in order to see the matter truly, we should be able to interpret individuals by wholes and vice versa. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, I suggest you to subscribe to the channel so that you will be notified when new videos are out. Also, you might want to check our link in the description, where you'll find many other fundamental advertising and psychology books in different languages. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again in the next video.